All right, before we get started, can I just get a quick show of hands? I'm kind of curious what people in the audience have experience with. How many people are using icon fonts, either through a library like Font Awesome or Bootstrap, or something custom you made with Icomoon, Fontello? Cool, that's a lot. How many of you are using React? What about Angular? Something else with components like Vue or Ember? Web components, Polymer? Jake. Cool. I'm first going to go over how icon fonts work and why I think they're not the best choice anymore. And then I'm going to talk about SVG icon systems and how you can use JavaScript components to make them just as easy to use as icon fonts. I've got some code samples in React and Angular. I'm most comfortable in Angular, and React seems to be the most popular right now. But if you don't understand all the code, or if you know a better way to write it, that's totally fine. The implementation details are totally up to you. I just want you to kind of get the idea. I'm also not suggesting you should bring in a library like React or Angular just for an icon system. But if you're already using a library that supports the idea of components and also using an icon font, my goal is to convince you to ditch the icon font and use components, SVG icons instead.
Kristie, we lost the feed.
What?
We lost the feed.
Did I step on something?
Do you have it?
Oh, sorry. Cool. Sorry. So yeah, if you're already using something like React or Angular and also using icon fonts, I'm going to hopefully try to convince you to get rid of the icon fonts. As Ryan mentioned, I'm a developer at Pluralsight, but I've got to throw out the disclaimer that all the stuff I'm presenting is just based on my own opinion. I'm still pretty new at Pluralsight. I just started there a couple months ago. And we do use React component-based SVG icon systems at Pluralsight, but I'm not on that team and don't really have anything to do with it. So most of my knowledge of icon systems comes from my last job, which was I worked on a global UI design system at WGU, and we had a few different icon systems. We had icon fonts and some SVG ones. None of them were particularly easy to use, so my WGU colleagues here can probably vouch for me when I say that I'm maybe more of an expert in how not to do an icon system than the other parts of this. So icon fonts are just fonts, but instead of using letters or numbers, they use glyphs. Generally, you use them by importing the font either in a link tag in your HTML or in a CSS import, and then you set the Unicode value for your icon in a pseudo element, and then you set the font family to the font, and then in your HTML, it's super easy. You just add the right classes, and your icon's automatically the right size, color, and alignment as the text you're using it by, which is super convenient. Also, they're vector, so they're fully scalable, and you can load them all in one HTTP request, which is obviously better than having a bunch of HTTP requests for separate image files or something like that. But they're not without their problems. They do tend to work pretty well most of the time, but when they don't, they can fail in some super weird ways. For example, this is a real thing that happened on Etsy. I think that 5th star is actually supposed to be like a half star, like 4.5 stars, but it was 4 stars and a horse. And this can happen because icon fonts rely on Unicode's private use area, and with emojis, every year we're just getting more and more emojis, and they start encroaching on that territory. And so some devices will override your Unicode declarations to serve their own emojis. If you're really careful about the Unicode characters you choose, you can avoid this, but nobody really pays attention to that, especially if you're using a tool that generates them for you. So that bug was probably the most famous one. People actually talked about making t-shirts, but it's happened other places too. That rose, I think, was supposed to be a carrot. This penguin here is probably supposed to be a menu icon, and I'm not really sure what's going on with these fists in ESPN. But they can also fail in expected ways. For example, after iOS 9, they made it so that you can use third-party blockers that integrate with Safari and block ads or social trackers or other things that basically just slow down your experience without providing you any value. And web fonts is one of those things. So users can just block all the web fonts because generally it shouldn't matter, if you don't really care about some custom font that takes an additional amount of time to load. These are all screenshots I took yesterday. This is Font Awesome's website on Firefox Focus, which is one of those blockers with web fonts disabled. Looks the same in Safari. So not super useful, obviously. You're missing all the icons. Their menu is gone. Another issue is extensions that people use. 1 in 10 people are dyslexic, and a lot of dyslexic people will use extensions like Open Dyslexic that make the text easier to read. So basically, it makes the bottom of the characters heavier so that there's more distinction between lines. And then it also makes the characters more distinct so that like L's, I's, J's, and 1's don't all look the same. And it helps them have a better time reading the text. On the W3 Schools site, they were missing, they had some icon fonts, so we're missing some icons there. I just turned on these extensions and browsed around the internet, and it can be pretty frustrating, I imagine, if you're trying to just do normal stuff and see, I have no idea what this is. One of these is a plus and one of these is a minus, I think, but it's pretty impossible. Here's another extension, a different one for dyslexic users that gives you more choices for fonts besides just Open Dyslexic, and it renders the whole Font Awesome site completely useless, basically. Here's another extension called Alpha Text that makes it so you can change the size, color, font family, background color, pretty much whatever you want. So if you want to say that I want everything to be 20 pixels Arial because I can't read this 14 pixel base size that people are using on their websites, you can do that, but it'll break all the icon fonts. And it's not just visually impaired people that use this. I've worked with a developer that likes to put the whole internet in dark mode. And font face doesn't work at all in Opera Mini. Opera Mini has a little over 2% usage, I think, globally, but it's got a massive market share in developing countries like Africa, India, and those areas where 2 and 3G connections are as good as you're going to get, and it can be super spotty. Opera Mini and other proxy browsers like UC Browser consume less battery and less data, and so they provide a better experience to users with kind of crappy connections that otherwise it would take forever to load anything. And so these browsers basically take your website and compress it before serving it up to the user. And they disable web fonts because according to them, they're just for aesthetic branding purposes, and you should use SVGs because that's what they're for. So let's talk about SVGs. First thing you need to do is get the SVG file. I think this is the biggest gotcha in this whole system, is working with designers to get the SVG file in the format that you need it. I recommend putting all your SVGs on a square that's the same size. For example, 24 pixels by 24 pixels. Stuff's going to be a little bit sharper if you choose a dimension that is like a multiple of the size that you're going to use it at, because that way you're never going to run into a risk of splitting pixels, which can make it really slightly, like, I can never tell a difference, but I think some designers can. So if you're using an icon that's 16 pixels, usually make them all 24 pixels, it's good. But you can't always just make everything go edge to edge, because, for example, with this carrot icon, you wouldn't want it to be the same size proportionally to the other icons, because they're usually used kind of in a small way. So it's kind of tricky to work through how you want them to be sized on the artboard itself. When you get an SVG, it's typically going to, if you're exporting from a design program like Inkscape or Sketch or Illustrator, you're going to get something like this, which is kind of hard to look at and not something you ever want to really just paste into your HTML. But luckily, there's a build tool for that called SVGO, and there's also a web GUI called SVG-OMG. That's what this is. So you can just paste in your markup. That was the Angular icon. And look how much smaller it got. And then you can turn on different options that will change the output code. You can change your point precision and things like that and work through that. And then, just take this and you can save it. It'll tell you how much savings you got. You can save that, and then the easiest thing to do would be to just put it in an image file. But that is not great because you're making a separate HTTP request for each one. So another thing you can do is use it as a background image in CSS, but you have the same problem with that. Another thing you can do is data URI encode it as a base 64 string, which is basically inlining it into your CSS. And there's build tools you can use to do that for you, or like web GUIs where you just upload it and it gives you the string. That's okay, but not great because you don't have all the same flexibility that you have with just a normal SVG. You can't style all the parts of it with CSS and stuff like that. So one of the best ways is to just inline it. This is good for performance, especially if you're gzipping, and you just basically put it in your HTML just like that. But the problem here is that if you have this icon repeated in multiple places, then you would have to go and update your icon in a million different places if you wanted to change what your email icon looks like. So that's not good to just use like that. So the best thing before we get into any JavaScript, your best option is going to be to sprite them. And basically what you do is have SVG, and you put a display none on it, and then you put all of your icons as symbols with an ID. And then when you need to use them, you use a use xlink href with a value of the ID of the symbol. Kind of complicated, and this is kind of more code than would be nice to put in your HTML. You have to remember to type xlink href and the ID, but overall it's a decent option, especially if you're using a single page app and you can just load that once and then you have all your icons in one place. One of the disadvantages with this is it uses the shadow DOM. It basically puts all of your SVG content inside the shadow DOM within here, so you can't use CSS to style like the individual pieces of the SVG within it. And there's some limitations there. But before we get into components, let's just talk a little bit about why SVGs are a better choice than icon fonts. So first of all, they're more reliable. You're not going to have any of those issues we looked at earlier with emojis overriding your icons or them not working with extensions and things like that. They have really good browser support. all the way back to IE9. Below IE8 and below, they start to have issues. So if you're really set on making things work in IE6, they might not be the best choice. But if you're using React and stuff, you're probably not worried about IE6. They're also more semantic. If this is something you care about, it's hard to argue with the fact that, you know, an I or a span has no semantic meaning and is kind of a hack, a brilliant hack at that, but it's still a hack and the browser is treated as such. And an SVG is a scalable vector graphic. It provides you more information, and that's kind of what they were designed for. They also have better rendering. It's a slight difference, but while SVGs and icon fonts are both vector, font icons are treated like text, so they're anti-aliased, which can make them slightly less sharp than an SVG, which is just going to be a true vector graphic. And they're way more flexible than icon fonts. You can do multi-color icons, which you can't do on icon fonts without stacking them. You've seen in like Font Awesome, you can stack your icons, but that kind of sucks because you have to put multiple HTML elements on top of each other, like absolutely positioned, and they don't line up quite right, so it's not really worth the effort. With SVGs, you can just export it from whatever design program you use with the colors, and those hex values will be put on the paths. And then you can even override it if you just want to make it single color in your CSS. The only way to do that really is with a descendant selector, which I don't like, but in this case, I think it's the only way to do it. Here's another example of one icon with 3 different states. This is all the same icon, but you can just add different CSS classes to change how the icon looks. So here's the code for that. SVGs have additional CSS things you can use, like fill and stroke, that aren't available to you with normal elements like a div. And that gives you more control and the ability to style more parts of it with CSS. Normally, you might have to have multiple HTML elements that get conditionally switched out based on a status, but using this strategy, you can just change the class. They can also be animated in much fancier ways than icon fonts. Icon fonts, you can change things like the color and the opacity, but you can't control individual pieces of the icon or like draw lines and stuff like that. Here's the code for that. We're basically animating the stroke dash offset from 34 to 0. Here's another fancier one. I tried to recreate the Pluralsight logo that you see in the videos at the beginning to see if I could do that with just SVG and CSS. And you don't need any JavaScript to do that. So this is the HTML. We have a clipping mask. Basically, it's the circle, so that the triangles can come from behind the circle, and you won't see them until they get inside the circle. So that's the circle clipping mask. And then I put classes on the circle and the big triangle and the small triangle so I could style them individually with CSS. And then this isn't the full CSS. I had to kind of crop it to make it fit on the slide. But the circle, we're animating the dash offset again from 70 to 0. And then the triangles, we're translating the X at different animation durations, so like that. They're also way more maintainable. This is kind of the thing that controls your road rage levels on your commute on the way home. So if you spent 5 hours trying to update one icon, you're not going to be in a very good mood. So it's going to be better for everyone around you if you just use an icon system that allows you to do that kind of stuff in just a couple minutes and then get back to whatever the more exciting task that you were working on before might be. You can also run into CORS issues. If you're using an icon font, it's likely that you're going to want to host it on a CDN. But Firefox won't let you do that without having the right course header set, and so depending on how your server's set up and what kind of permissions you have, that could be kind of a nightmare to deal with. With inline SVG icons, this is an example of just a chevron icon. We're going to go through some different examples of how you can do that. So this is the raw SVG. You can do some stuff in CSS to make it work more like an icon font. So you can put the width and height to 1em, which will make it the same height and width as the text that is around. And you can set the fill to current color, which will be the parent context color. And you might want to split some of those things into a separate class. You might also want to do something to align them to the baseline of the text using like a vertical align property. But current color is basically just a CSS value that applies the color value to properties that, other properties like the fill in this case. They're not specific, it's not specific to SVGs, but that's the only thing I've really used it for. So Jen talked a bit about accessibility and said not to use the ARIA tags, but this is one of the situations where they're really useful. For most cases, an icon is purely decorative, and you don't really want to put alt text or something because you don't want a screen reader to read star or whatever. You would want to just say what it's used for. Or there's already text next to it that describes what it does, and it's totally decorative, so you don't care. In that case, you just put an ARIA hidden of true. That's what I do on all my icons, and if you look at like the Angular material icon docs or Font Awesome docs, that's what they all tell you to do. So in a case like this, it's totally fine. We have a button with a caret or a chevron arrow that is just decorative. It says next, so the icon doesn't really do anything special. You can just ignore it for screen reader users. But in this case, where we don't have any other text, it's important to put some alternative text there. So if you have an ARIA hidden on the SVG, you can put an ARIA label on the button that just says the label text. You can also use a title attribute, but that will put a little yellow tooltip, which some people don't like. You can also use visually hidden text, but this is the least amount of markup and doesn't change anything for sighted users, so that's what I usually go with. At a super basic level, to make this a component, you could just copy and paste the SVG right into a React component and use it like that. The disadvantage there is you'd have to make a separate component for every single icon because it's not dynamic in any way. In Angular, same thing. It might look like this. You just put the SVG in there with the ARIA hidden and everything else, and the paths inside it, and then you have a separate component for each one. There's quite a few component libraries that have a system like this, but they likely have a build tool or something that is automatically generating them. If you're already using React or Angular, there's a good chance you're using Webpack. And Webpack gives you a lot of flexibility to do all kinds of things to files that you want to import into your components. So by default, with the Webpack for the Angular CLI, if you eject it, all your SVGs are going through the file loader, which is the default loader. And if you're going to try to customize this, you'll need to either declare your loader first or delete the SVG regex from that. And then for create React app, it's the opposite. They're using exclude, so any files that don't meet these regexes will go through that loader. And I spent an hour one night trying to figure out why my React demo didn't work with the same code from my Angular demo, and it was because of this file loader and the Webpack config that I didn't realize was there. So to make a custom loader in Webpack, you can basically, you add your rule for the regex. You might want to do something more specific like .icon.svg if you want to have other SVGs that get loaded through the file loader or other loaders. But then you add your custom loader and then any other loaders that you want it to go through. SVGO is the thing I talked about where with the SVG-OMG web GUI, it basically allows you to optimize the SVG and you can set different options that control what types of things get added or removed. And it goes from right to left, so in this case from bottom to top. Goes through SVGO loader first and then my custom loader. And in my custom loader, using Cheerio, which is kind of like a stripped down version of jQuery that works in Node, and you can basically just export a stringified version of everything that's inside the SVG. The reason I'm doing this is because I don't like using descendant selectors, and I think Angular already creates enough wrapper elements without me adding another one to put the SVG inside. You wouldn't have to do this. You could, there's actually another loader called SVG Inline Loader that just does the stringified version of whatever you put through it. But because I wanted to just pull out the stuff that was inside the SVG tag and not the SVG element itself, I did it this way. And then in your component, you can dynamically require the file based on a URL slug that you pass in through the props. And then set the inner HTML of your SVG to that path data that went through those loaders. And then because the view box is the same for all of them, if they're all 24 by 24 pixel squares, you can just assume that's always the same and you're always going to have ARIA hidden. So this part doesn't change, it's just the part inside the SVG. And then, like Jen was talking about, if you want to use something like Glamorous to encapsulate your styles, you can do that instead of importing a CSS file, and then you can have it all right there in your component. And then in your app.js or wherever you're going to use it, you just have your icon and you have a prop, a slug prop, and then any other class names you want to put on it, maybe to change the color or override some default styles. You use it just like that. In Angular, one of the first things you need to do if using this Webpack strategy is to put your node types. Otherwise, TypeScript won't compile because it'll give you a type error for the require. It only lets you do imports unless you do that. And you can't, imports can't be dynamic. So same thing with the Angular component. We're taking an input with the URL slug and then dynamically requiring that and then putting all the content inside the inner HTML for our root element, which is the SVG. So I'm going to do some demos. So this is the icon component we just looked at. I'm just doing the React version. I have another icon docs component that basically goes through all of the icons in this folder and gets the file name and then loads the icon component with the slug from the file name. And that looks like this. So now if I go in Illustrator and add a new component, let's say a star. Made it too big. Save it as star.svg in that folder. It showed up. And it's that and so it's that easy to add a new icon. And if you want to adjust something because you're like, yeah, I think I want to make it a little smaller, you could totally just do that and then save, and it would show up in your browser. And so it's a lot faster and easier to debug with a system like that. So and these are all the code that I showed is all on my GitHub. I can go back to those links after. But just to summarize, don't use SVG components if you need it to work in something lower than IE8, but otherwise they're better in pretty much every way. They won't fail in weird ways. They work with proxy browsers. They work with font overrides. They're vector and not anti-alias. They can be multicolor. They can be animated. You can animate the individual parts. They're dependent on the source files, so you're not going to lose track of those since they live directly in your repo. And they can be included individually, so you don't need to load all 250 icons for your one project just because you need one of them. And they're super easy to use and easy to maintain. Questions? Go ahead.
What makes it easier to maintain?
Well, for icon fonts, I think that if you are using something custom, I mean, obviously if you're using Font Awesome or something, you're not maintaining it because you're just relying on whatever they give you. But it's easier to maintain because you don't have weird bugs like we talked about, and then also because the files live directly in your as part of the component, so you're not going to lose track of those. I worked on a project once. It was like a legacy visual force page, and it had its own custom icon font that had been developed by iCoMoon, and the people that made it didn't work there anymore, and nobody really knew where the source files were, and so there was no easy way to just update the font and add one additional icon or something, because I then would have to go and turn each font into an icon, re-upload them, like unless you have the password for the account, and then, yeah. Questions? Anyone else? Go ahead.
What would be your advice for moving off of Font Awesome, like away? Like how?
I have a slide for that, an emergency one.
We just like I use Font Awesome in like a Jekyll website, so we don't have like a build system per se, other than like the Jekyll pipeline, and we definitely use Font Awesome all over the place.
So one of the things I might consider doing if you were using components, but you have, for example, the same icon font used across like 30 different repos, and you don't want them to change at all, and while you're updating them, you could just make kind of a temporary component that is the same as your SVG component would be, but then it's just the icon font thing, like you're just your I tag, and then when you're ready, you could update them all. If you're not using any sort of build tools like Webpack or any sort of components like React or Angular, I might consider doing the sprites if you wanted to do SVGs.
Is there like a library of SVGs that would easily replace like a Font Awesome font?
There are lots, yeah. Sorry, I can't find that one side. So there's like, for components or just, like, so there's Angular or not Angular material, but just Google material icons. That's where I pulled all the ones for the presentation. There's a whole bunch of them. And you can download the SVG and then use it yourself. There's lots of, if you go to GitHub and type in like SVG icons system, there's a lot of stuff. There's like re-icons, I know, is a thing, and feather icons. They're all kind of slightly different implementations. So if I like to have full control of that sort of thing and not rely on choices that may or may not work for me in the future. So I don't know. I don't know that I have super specific advice.
Do you think that libraries like Font Awesome and such, do you think they will eventually adopt this mindset, change the way they do it?
So Font Awesome 5, I couldn't hear you super well, but I think what you're asking is, will those libraries eventually move to SVGs? Yeah? No?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So Font Awesome 5 actually has a really hilarious Kickstarter that you can watch, and one of their goals is doing SVGs. They're switching to SVGs. I know GitHub's Octi icons or whatever, they switched to SVGs. Bootstrap just got sick of all the issues that people were filing for icons, and so they're just getting rid of them. And so the new version of Bootstrap doesn't even have icons at all. But I do think that most of those sorts of icon libraries are moving towards offering an SVG option. And you're seeing a lot of people using like React components for icons. That's pretty popular. There's a lot of different implementations. The way I present it is just how I like it, and that's mostly based on the fact that I'm kind of a CSS specificity nerd, and I don't like to have multiple nested components, and I like to have full control over everything with CSS, so that's why I did it like that. But there's a lot of other ways you can do it, and they're all great and way better than icon fonts. Go ahead.
What other emergency slides do you have?
None.
So this is a really cool topic. Where could I go to learn more? Like, do you have any favorite resources that you've pulled from, other than the Google or the Yahoo?
Mostly just the Google. Chris Coyer has a good book on SVGs that I bought, but I didn't read the whole thing. Sarah Drasner has a lot of great material on animating SVGs if you want to learn more about how to do crazy stuff with SVG animations. And then as far as doing icon systems, I tend to just look at GitHub and look and see what's the Angular material team doing, what are all these other libraries doing, and maybe get some ideas. I didn't really find anyone doing it with Webpack like that. I just thought that seemed like the easiest way that I could present with not a ton of code in a slide, because it's super simple. You're just requiring the icon, and it goes through the loader pipeline and gets optimized and everything.
Last question.
Go ahead. Oh.